So, I mean, it's estimated that in the United States alone, there's 50 million Americans that have an autoimmune disease, but millions more are somewhere on this autoimmune inflammation spectrum, one of the spokes on that spectrum that I talked about a moment ago. But for example, by the time somebody's diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, it's about 4 to 10 years prior to that diagnosis is when these things were brewing on this inflammation spectrum. So, for example, Addison's disease, autoimmune adrenal disease, there has to be 90% destruction of the adrenal glands before it fits mainstream medicine's criteria to be labeled with Addison's disease. And similar numbers for MS and celiac disease, ulcerative colitis, there has to be significant destruction, 70 to 90% destruction of certain parts of the body, depending on what we're talking about, before it fits all the boxes to say, hey, this is a diagnosis code, this is MS, this is ulcerative colitis, this is Sjogren's, whatever autoimmune disease we're talking about.
Hello and welcome to Goodness Love Alive. Today we're talking to Dr. Will Cole, author of The Inflammation Spectrum, functional medicine practitioner, and co-host of Goop Fellas. We're going to be learning all about inflammation, so don't miss out on this one. Let's dive in.
So Dr. Will Cole, thank you so much for joining us today. We are so excited to hear more about what you've just discovered in the bookland. We've heard you've been working on a book for a while and it's exploded on the scene. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so since we talked last, I've been up to some things, but my day job hasn't changed. My passion and my heart is talking to people via webcam, like we're talking right now, consulting them from our virtual functional medicine clinic. So mainly my 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., like Monday through Friday, immersion is in people's cases like that. But a natural extension of that, of my, at this point, 11 years of seeing patients with these various different autoimmune issues and inflammatory problems, is the book. It really is my exploration of this and how it's impacting so many people in so many far-reaching different ways. And that's where The Inflammation Spectrum, my second book, came about. It really was a natural extension of my love of my patients and seeing how we can use functional medicine and lifestyle changes and food as medicine to really calm inflammation. Because, as you know, but for people that maybe don't know, inflammation is really the commonality between just about every health problem under the sun. I mean, from autoimmune conditions to diabetes, heart disease, cancer, to I've been talking a lot about it in talking about the book, of educating people about the mental health inflammatory connection. And in the West, we like to separate mental health from physical health. Well, it's just a mental health problem and it's just a physical problem. But the reality is mental health is physical health. It's not separate. And our brain is part of our body, for people that were wondering. But the research looking at what's referred to as the cytokine model of cognitive function, it's how inflammation, cytokines are pro-inflammatory cells, how inflammation is impacting how our brains work, impacting mental health. So anxiety and depression and fatigue are inflammatory in nature as well. So there's so many different reasons. Hormonal problems are also inflammatory. There's so many different manifestations of chronic inflammation. So the book is really born out of me seeing all of this on an hourly basis, talking to people online, and then, okay, what are ways we can really reclaim agency over our wellness? Because many people don't know they have any choice. They're just trying to do the right thing. They're going to their doctor's visits. They feel poorly maybe for so long, they just settle for it. And they don't realize that we oftentimes settle for so much when it comes to poor health.
Totally. Oh, Dr. Will Cole, you beautiful man. What a beautiful mission you have. And I'm so glad you put all these thoughts and experience into your book, The Inflammation Spectrum. But before we get into the concepts of the book, I would love to talk about inflammation, because I think it's a concept that gets spoken about a lot. People are like, oh, this is anti-inflammatory, therefore it's good for you, or, don't do that, it's inflammatory. But I think a lot of people, and myself included, when I first started this journey, I was definitely using those words a lot and not understanding what really I was talking about. Could you explain for us what is inflammation and what's the difference between acute inflammation and chronic inflammation?
Yeah, so implement, you're right. It is thrown around flippantly many times, and it is quite a ambiguous, nebulous term for people. Like, what is it? Maybe they think of migraines or like muscle and joint pain or, something like that. Yes, those are all inflammatory problems, but those are, like you said, more acute inflammatory responses. Inflammation by itself inherently isn't a bad thing. It's a part of our immune system. Inflammation fights viruses, it fights bacteria, it helps to heal wounds. The human race would not be here without healthy, balanced, measured inflammation levels. It's when inflammation is thrown out of balance, that's when problems arise. It's the chronic inflammation, it's the forest fire that burns and burns in perpetuity. That's the problem. And it's the Goldilocks principle. It's homeostasis, not too high, not too low, but just right. And with inflammation, it's just right when we need it. And that same, Goldilocks principle is applied to everything else in the body too. Our hormones, we want not too much, not too little, just right. Our microbiome, which we talked about last time, not too high, not too low, but just right. It's this balance. So this is really important for people to realize that yes, you're right, anti-inflammatory, we don't want too low inflammation. We just want a healthy modulation, balance of inflammation. Because, for example, people that are on immunosuppressants, that's not good either. They're prone to infections. That's one of the potential side effects of immunosuppressants because their inflammation isn't able to get up to where it needs to be to fight off a virus or bacteria. So it's important, and that's really what the book is, an exploration of different ways to balance inflammation levels in the body.
Well said. Awesome. So when you say spectrum, and I'm assuming this is talking about inflammation for people, how far along the journey are you in the inflammatory cascade before something bad happens? Could you speak a bit to that concept?
Yeah. So the term actually is that I used it first in Ketotarian in my first book because it is really how I see it consulting patients. It's this larger inflammation spectrum, this continuum. And the reason why I talked about it in Ketotarian is because beta hydroxybutyrate, the ketone that your body makes in nutritional ketosis, is an epigenetic modulator, meaning it does cool things for our body, one of which it lowers inflammation levels. So it's a natural anti-inflammatory. So what I wanted the inflammation spectrum book to be about is a deep dive into the concept beyond ketosis. It's not about ketosis at all in the second book. It's just about life itself and ways to calm inflammation and educating people on the inflammation spectrum as far as a deep dive is concerned in this concept. So it starts with mild symptoms on one end of the inflammation spectrum, like maybe mild anxiousness, maybe some bloating, maybe some weight loss resistance, fatigue on one end of the inflammation spectrum. And then on the other end of the inflammation spectrum, it's the diagnosable autoimmune disease or mental health problem or diabetes, something like this, and then everything in between. So I start the book out with a quiz, and the quiz is adapted from questions that I ask patients. And I want people to find out for themselves where they're at on the inflammation spectrum. And the quiz is also at drwillcole.com for people that don't want to get the book. I don't know why they wouldn't, but if they don't want to, they can just take the quiz for free. It's just adapted from functional medicine principles, but it's really an exploration of how I see the inflammation spectrum in my weird mind. And I'm not a good artist, so I had one of my friends, I said, hey, this is what I'm thinking about, make it look pretty. So that's what's in the book, so that people can visually see what I see consulting patients, is that there's 7 main sections on this inflammation spectrum. There's the gut, there's the brain, and the interconnectedness of those two, and then looking at hormones, and then looking at the blood sugar regulatory system, looking at detoxification, looking at the musculoskeletal system, and then autoimmunity as a separate entity when the immune system turns against the body itself. That's the 7. And then the 8th is the interconnectedness of all the 7. It's the polyinflammation. Inflammation in one area can beget a ripple effect of inflammation in another area, which a lot of my patients fall into that category. Like inflammation in the gut can impact the brain, and that can impact the hormones, and this sort of cascade, as you said, throughout the body. So that's what the inflammation spectrum is. And then everything after that in the book is really what are food ways for us to calm inflammation, and what are some non-food ways? What does the research show us today are ways we can really reclaim our health to calm inflammation, no matter how it's manifesting in our body?
Awesome. This is such a relevant thing for our community, because so many of our people come and they watch a lot of our content and they realize, oh, inflammation is much bigger. It's like the tip of the iceberg as to what it's actually causing, and the damage it can do on the body. So I'm curious, why are we seeing such an explosion of autoimmune diseases, disease in general, particularly in the last 20 or 30 years? Is it because our detection methods for these diseases are improving, or is there an underlying cause?
I think part of it probably is growing awareness and testing, and because I think this was going on longer than what the realization of it was. Because you look even today, is vastly underdiagnosed. I can only imagine a generation ago, or even our grandparents' generation. So I think it's a confluence of two different things. I do believe, and researchers in this space would agree with me, that these numbers are growing, but that's coinciding with better technology and better testing and more awareness around this, of this larger autoimmune inflammation spectrum. So, I mean, it's estimated that in the United States alone, there's 50 million Americans that have an autoimmune disease, but millions more are somewhere on this autoimmune inflammation spectrum, one of the spokes on that spectrum that I talked about a moment ago. But for example, by the time somebody's diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, it's about 4 to 10 years prior to that diagnosis is when these things were brewing on this inflammation spectrum. So, for example, Addison's disease, autoimmune adrenal disease, there has to be 90% destruction of the adrenal glands before it fits mainstream medicine's criteria to be labeled with Addison's disease. And similar numbers for MS and celiac disease, ulcerative colitis, there has to be significant destruction, 70 to 90% destruction of certain parts of the body, depending on what we're talking about, before it fits all the boxes to say, hey, this is a diagnosis code, this is MS, this is ulcerative colitis, this is Sjogren's, whatever autoimmune disease we're talking about. There's over 100, and an additional 40 above that 100 that at least have an autoimmune component. And I don't doubt for a second that as time goes on and science understands it better, we're going to find autoimmune components to more health problems that aren't even considered autoimmune today. So the reality is this is a major problem. And so it's definitely near and dear to my heart. I have autoimmune conditions on both sides of my family. So it's not just a clinical thing for me. I am passionate about it for my patients, but it's definitely something that I've seen close to home too, of what this can do when a flare-up happens in any shape or form.
I can definitely relate to this myself as well. I remember going into the doctor's office. I was, this is 8 years ago when I was starting my journey, but I'd gotten to that tipping point where I was like not okay with what was happening. I was like, oh, I'm tired, I'm sore, I'm sad, and so we did some testing, and I'm thankful that they at least did some testing. And he was like, oh, you have autoimmune markers, but don't worry, like 10% of the population does. Okay, bye. And so obviously I hadn't got to that, I didn't have Addison's, but in that example, 90% of my function gone before I was taken seriously. And I know a lot of our viewers, watch our stuff because they too are sick and need help, and they're searching for answers. And I think it's a great thing to know that wherever you are on this spectrum, those symptoms are important, and let's see what we can do. And I think I love your mission, Will. So for anyone listening right now, you talked about, how to be in touch with your body, I suppose, and understanding what symptoms you have and to understand where you are in the spectrum. Could you talk through that quiz, and what sort of markers do you help people analyze in their own bodies?
Sure. So I think that the quiz takes them through the system. So let's talk about like digestion, for example. These are some signs and symptoms that someone would want to check in with their digestion, which is interesting, and you guys know this, but 75% of the immune system's in the gut. So to understand inflammation, you have to look at where the predominance of the immune system resides, which is in the gastrointestinal system. So there's a lot of gut-centric components to people's inflammation. Now, it may be manifesting in digestive symptoms, or it may not be. There's a lot of underlying gut problems that are showing up systemically in the brain, or in the hormone system, or in the musculoskeletal system, because of the cascade and because of the power and the governing authority that the gastrointestinal system has. In the case of intestinal permeability, there's a lot of different far-reaching health problems associated with leaky gut syndrome that aren't digestive. So it's important to know that you may or may not have digestive problems with underlying gut issues. So, for example, bowel movement frequency is important, and I talk about bowel movements so much that I don't realize how not polite it is. But it is important to talk about, and people need to not be shy about that. So be aware of the Bristol chart. You can Google it, but knowing where you're at in the Bristol chart, your formation, you want about 1 to 2 snakes a day, as they say, well formed. And if there's something going on there as far as decreased frequency, increased frequency, or formation that is not healthy, that can be a sign. That could be a check engine light, so to speak, that something's going on underneath the hood, proverbially speaking. And that goes on for many things. So we talk about that in the digestive area of the quiz. And then we like the hormonal system. We talk about things, more obscure things, like the outer third of your eyebrows thinning. That may be, why is he asking me about that? But that can be a sign that the thyroid may be off. If you're craving salt, or if you get dizzy when you get up too quickly, that can be a sign that the HP axis is off, the brain adrenal axis is off. So on and so forth. I go through the different systems of just different things that people can notice in their life of where they're at. And the more that you're accumulating these things that are signs that are off, the more you can see inflammation, a sign of inflammation in the body, a sign of chronic inflammation in the body. So that's what I talk about. And then in the mental health space is really important, because honestly, if I had to think about what are the 2 most common things that I do see, it is things going on in the digestion. It's bloating. It's some sort of GI issue, even if it's mild, and neurological issues. So things like anxiousness, anxiety, fatigue is definitely very common. Brain fog, which it's interesting, people being able to differentiate their brain fog from the fatigue. Like they could have a decent energy day, but still have trouble with word recall or name recall, or just a fuzziness in their brain, and that's inflammatory, and depression, of course. So those are the common things that I would see for people to kind of be aware of saying, okay, what's going on? And just because something's common doesn't necessarily mean it's normal. Like people think because they go through it every day, they just settle for it, or they look around at themselves, at their friends and family, and maybe it's easy to find someone that feels more lousy than you do, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's normal. Chronic health problems are really, really rampant. So it doesn't mean you should settle for it. These are things we can largely overcome and support and reverse, heal. We shouldn't settle for anything less. So that's really where the book kind of starts out, with educating people on that. I forgot to answer the one question that you said about why is it. I think it's a larger, I think we talked about this before too, with autoimmune conditions and gut problems, but it's this larger mismatch between genetics and epigenetics. So research estimates that our genetics haven't changed in 10,000 years, but yet our world has changed very dramatically in a very short period of time when you're putting it in the context with the totality of human history. So that is what researchers are looking at. It's our food supply, it's toxins, it's stress levels, it's all of these things that our genes are living in a brave new world in many ways, and it's triggering that latent genetic predisposition that have been around for a long time, but they're being awoken like never before because of this onslaught of epigenetic triggers that is stressing our genome out, basically.
Oh, that's so fascinating, and I'm curious to think. So, you talk a lot about in your book food triggers, and what was confusing, at least for me, for maybe the common man that people can relate to, Sarah starts getting these inflammation issues, sore joints. She's in her 20s. And interestingly enough, she said, well, I'm going to cut out gluten and dairy. And I think, it's part of this food elimination diet. And I'm thinking, this is crazy. Like millions of people.
Very supportive husband. Yeah. He's like, do we have to get gluten-free pizza base? Man, it tastes like cardboard.
You're ruining my life.
So, hey, common joy. I'm like 10,000 caveman, right? Trying to work this stuff out. And tell us why that happens. So why particular food triggers, in Sarah's case, dairy, gluten are coming up as, and I'm like, well, you're not celiac. So, and millions of people eat this. This is in your brain. why are some certain foods triggering for others and other people are completely fine? Would love to dive more into this.
Yeah. So this is at the heart of functional medicine. And this is part of the reason why the inflammation spectrum book was really difficult to write, because there's a lot of variables to consider. And I wanted to communicate it in a way that made sense, because there's really very few broad sweeping, overgeneralized statements other than eat real food. Everything else is fair game as far as, well, what real foods? Because there could be healthy foods that are whole foods, real foods that work great for one person and flare the next person up. So it's really important that I wanted to convey that. Like, it's one thing for me to be able to talk to somebody via Skype or webcam and for me to look at their labs and make all this make sense, but it was really difficult to put it in book form. So it took longer to take the algorithm that someone could kind of choose their own wellness path based off of this quiz score, because of that bioindividuality, which is really the heart of functional medicine. We're all different with a lot of different variables, from a genetics and epigenetics and all the different variables of epigenetics. So this is the what I call, you mentioned dairy and gluten. In the book, there's multiple tracks based off of their quiz score, and then a toolbox based off of their area that they're higher in. So let's just say they're higher in the gut area. They have different foods and practices to focus on than if you've scored higher in the hormone section, for example. But gluten and dairy, they're part of what I call in the book the core four. So those are grains, dairy, industrial seed oils like canola oil, vegetable oil, soybean oil, high omega-6 oils basically, and added sugar, which should be a no-brainer, I guess, for most people. But those four foods or food additives are what I call in the book the core four. Why? It's because there's a growing amount of evidence, quite a lot of studies looking at those four food areas are the most likely to be the most inflammatory in most people. Now, I'm not saying they're inflammatory for everybody. Everybody's going to have the same response. They won't have the same response, because if I hung my hat on one way of eating for everybody, I'd be proven wrong all day long consulting patients. So I have to keep an open mind, be intellectually flexible to an open mind to what's possible and and use their real life as a lab and tracking these things. But those four foods are the most common. And why is that? It's because that evolutionary mismatch between the foods we eat and our genome. So grains, for example, have gone through quite a transformation over human history. Now they're hybridized. Wheat is hybridized. A lot of times it's sprayed with glyphosate. Other grains are genetically modified. It's a new breed to our gut microbiome. It's a new breed to our genetics. And this mismatch, genetics, epigenetics mismatch, is really at the heart of what researchers are looking at as being one factor, not the only factor, one factor that can trigger inflammation levels, autoimmunity, increased intestinal permeability or leaky gut syndrome, which then triggers autoimmunity. So it's this mismatch. So is it the hybridization? Is it the genetic modification in some grains? Is it the glyphosate spraying? Or is it the overconsumption of it or the preparation of it? Because traditionally, grains would have been prepared, soaked, sprouted, all of these things. And that's not the way people are eating them. And for some variables, it's maybe the overconsumption of them. And from an evolutionary ancestral health perspective, the grains would have been largely used during times of famine. They store well, so they're maybe a good option for survival, but not necessarily thriving. So people are eating a lot of a food that is basically a famine food as a feast food. So there's a lot of things to consider, and not all grains are created equal. We definitely have a nuanced conversation in the book about the different types of grains and what the research is showing. But gluten, which is the protein found in wheat and rye and oat and barley and spelt, that's definitely higher on the inflammation spectrum scale compared to some other grains. But even some of these other grains, there's something called molecular mimicry, which the proteins in, let's say, rice or corn are similar enough in structure to gluten. And this is one of the labs that I talk about in the book, and something that I run for patients is the protein in that corn, let's just say, for example, or even in the protein in dairy or chocolate or coffee. It's a lot of different foods that are can undergo molecular mimicry where the immune system is so irritated by gluten that's cross-reacting to these other grains as well, which is quite interesting because let's just say eggs show up on that, or a gluten-free grain shows up on that. It's not a rice sensitivity, it's a gluten sensitivity to rice. So this is another way that the immune system behaves abnormally to these otherwise whole foods. They are not junk food, but the immune system is overreacting to it. And same with dairy, the crossbreeding of cows, and we talk about the beta A1 casein and the beta A2 casein in the book, but this original sort of primordial beta A2 casein is not really found very often. Most of the dairy found in the West is beta A1. And this mismatch between genetics and epigenetics can trigger problems. So people tend to do better with A2. Some people still don't do well with the A2 milk either, because maybe of the overconsumption and because their immune system is so overreactive. So those are the two reasons why gluten and dairy. So definitely it would be advantageous to consider going off of those for a while and then try reintroducing them and seeing how you do. You may do fine with them. You may not be.
What I think is, amazing piece there. Thank you for sharing that. What I think is really practical for a lot of people is that a lot of people in our community, they show up to their doctor, they have inflammation somewhere, but the labs are run, or traditional labs are run, and everything looks clear. They're not there. I guess you would say they're not in a life or death scenario. So they're not thriving, but they're surviving. So the doctor goes, "You're good." Can you explain to me why, so many people are in this frustrating loop, looking for answers, and that's the answer they get from maybe a traditional doctor or someone that's not looking as deep as you would into what is actually going underneath the hood. So can you explain that process, why it perhaps is a little bit broken, and what people can do to, I guess, take the reins of their own health, maybe start an elimination diet or whatever it is? Tell us about that process and what people can actually practically do starting today.
Well, it's really this training in the standard model of care. So it's just really not an indictment of any one doctor. This is really the system and how it's set up. So the standard model of care, wherever you're at in the West, whether it's United States, Canada, UK, Australia, really, they're largely trained to diagnose the disease and match it with the medication. And we have patients all over the world. And I thought it was just an American thing years ago, but it's really not. It's maybe worse than the United States in many ways, but it's still a systemic global problem. It's this reactionary system that is trained to diagnose and prescribe medications, or diagnose and refer to surgery, or refer out to another specialist. So other than that system, there's a lot of people that fall through the cracks of that because they are not fitting all the criteria, and they are left to fend for themselves. So most of my patients fall into that category where they've either exhausted everything that conventional medicine has given them and they still feel poorly, or they were told there's nothing wrong with them, and they're sent home. And they're told they're just depressed, basically, because that's the easy umbrella advice to see you're depressed. Here's an antidepressant, because there's no lab for that. But that's a problem. That is a major problem. And I think growing amount of doctors are aware of that now. And you look at the Institute for Functional Medicine, IFM, where most of my colleagues are conventionally trained. And they're going through IFM certification process because they're seeing this problem that I'm seeing. And it's interesting that they're going back into the mainstream system and changing it in their own way. And for some people, they can't, because the way the system's set up, they have 5 minutes with the patient and they're overbooked, and that's the way the system's set up. So they're either have to be okay with that, they know it for themselves, and help the patient in any way they can with the time that they have, or they are forced to leave the conventional system and have a private clinic or something like that, because the system's just not set up for healthcare. It's designed for disease management. It's designed for sick care, some would call it. But it's really the training. I bring up a study in the inflammation spectrum where it was one of the medical journals where the majority of traditionally trained doctors would fail a basic nutrition test. You can learn more, way, way, way more on YouTube in a half an hour than what doctors are taught in years, because it's just not a priority to the system. So that's really a problem, and there's no excuse for it. We need to do better.
Yeah, we took 100% agree. And, so many people that obviously that will come through your door and people that thousands of people that you've helped, luckily have been able to find answers in this, and which is really cool. We're seeing a massive resurgence in it. So I'm curious about people that come through obviously we can talk about the grand system, but let's just take a zoom down into someone's real life. We've spoken about our lives. What is it, when you treat people, do you have any case studies or examples of someone that has come through your door and we have before and after, or we can see a direct impact of some of the things that you're talking about?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because I do. I do. And this is a great archetype for a lot of patients that I have. But this is a patient that came up. I don't know can people see it on the screen now? Can we pull it up here? Okay, perfect. So this is a patient that came to us at the beginning of 2019. And we tested it in August of 2019. She's still a patient now, but she came in. Let me just give you a little bit of background with her. She was in in the Midwest. She was in the Midwest. We're in Pittsburgh in United States, but like I said, most of our patients are online. She was in Iowa at the time. I think she's moved since then, but it was debilitating fatigue, runaway anxiety. She described it as that wired and tired feeling, like she just was like frazzled, but exhausted. So she had trouble winding down at the end of the day. She had heart palpitations. She was told, similarly to you, Sarah, that it looked autoimmune, but she never fit all the boxes to say, okay, this is exactly what it is. And she just had these runaway inflammatory symptoms. So this is a test, and we ran more labs than just this. This is just the blood test. So we're putting this on a spreadsheet. We're comparing it to the Institute for Functional Medicine, IFMs, and we trained all the doctors at the Cleveland Clinic's Functional Medicine Center, and who's trained myself and my team. So these are the standardized numbers that I'm largely looking at. So from a blood standpoint, because I guess I should mention this, the labs reference range that you get on your conventional labs is based largely on a statistical bell curve average of people who go to labs. So just because you're within the labs reference range, back to what I said earlier, just because something's common doesn't make it normal. Well, this is a perfect example of this. Comparing yourself to the population that goes to labs is not a good metric for you to see how you can feel your best. So what they're unintentionally telling people like this is you're a lot like the other people with health problems that you're being compared to. So we're looking at a tighter range within that larger reference range that you see on the lab to see where optimal wellness is. So for example, let's look at the left side. You can see the numbers. The things that are in the red are things that are outside of the optimal range, and things that are in the green are in the optimal range. Just because you're outside of our range doesn't necessarily mean you're outside the lab's reference range. So red doesn't inherently mean pathological, but it just means it's a check engine light. We want to see where things are going. So her glucose was higher, her A1C was higher, which is the 3-month average of her blood sugar. We saw her HDL was functionally low as well. Her C-reactive protein, which is an inflammatory protein. This was high sensitivity C-reactive protein. We want that to be under 1. She was at 6. And was interesting pattern here. She had high ferritin levels. Ferritin is considered an acute phase reactant. So in states of inflammation, you can see ferritin spike. You have to put this into context because you can have high iron too and hemochromatosis like this as well, or iron overload. For this, it wasn't the case because she had normal iron, normal total iron binding capacity, and normal iron saturation. So therefore, the ferritin was, in her case, high because of the inflammation. I'm going to go down just the original labs first, and then you can see the differences because I just want to bring the context to this. The next thing I'm seeing is the functionally low white blood cells. Very common to see this functionally low in my patient base. Many people that are listening to this now will say, oh, my white blood count is normally lower too, but no one ever talks to me about it. This is very common. There's a lot of chronic infections and gut-centric components to inflammation that's causing this chronic infection pattern where you see functionally low white blood count. We want to see that increase as we're getting the immune system calmed down and more resilient. Then we ran a full thyroid panel, and this is important to look at this because you can have a normal TSH a normal thyroid stimulating hormone, but have underlying thyroid problems. So the American Endocrine Society, many other studies show this as well, shows that upwards of 90% of low thyroid in the West is autoimmune in nature, Hashimoto's disease or autoimmune thyroiditis and Graves' disease. So this is quite important here because you can't hang your hat on one number on the lab and say that's the totality of why you feel the way that you do. So TSH was normal for her. So if you ran just the conventional thyroid panel, it would involve a TSH and maybe a T4. Now for her, those were fine. Then if you left it at that, you'd say everything's fine. But the reality is she had a few things. She had low T3 syndrome, meaning her body wasn't converting T4 to T3. It wasn't activating the thyroid hormone. 80% of the conversion of T4 to T3 happens in the liver and 20% happens in the gut. So you have to look at liver health and gut health to understand thyroid conversion. And you have to look at nutrient deficiencies that make up the thyroid hormones too, and the enzyme that breaks down and converts T4 to T3. So she had low T3, and she also had high reverse T3. So your body, in states of inflammation, your body can create more of something called reverse T3, which is sort of a thyroid analog in a way where it's unusable by the body. It can bind to the thyroid receptor sites and create and elicit these low thyroid symptoms, whether that's hair loss like she was having, weight gain, or fatigue. It was contributing to her fatigue. It wasn't the totality of her fatigue, but it was part of it. And she had a third component to her thyroid, and it was the autoimmune marker. So thyroid peroxidase antibody, which is an antibody that's basically a flag for destruction against the enzyme that makes the thyroid hormone, or thyroid peroxidase. But if you notice, the other thyroid antibody, thyroid globulin antibody, was negative. So you'll see this in a certain subset of people with Hashimoto's or autoimmune thyroid issues, is that one of the antibodies will be positive and one won't. Now, to fit the strict criteria of diagnosis for Hashimoto's, you need both to be positive and a high TSH. So she would be on this autoimmune inflammation spectrum. She wouldn't fit of all the mainstream medicine's criteria to be labeled with Hashimoto's disease, but she is having signs of it in her symptoms and on labs. Both subjectively and objectively, we're looking at the data and what she's experiencing and seeing this pattern in her life. Is it the totality of why she feels the way that she does? No, but it's a piece of the puzzle. Normally, it's a perfect storm of a lot of different things, a confluence of factors. So we have sort of a three-tiered problem with her thyroid here. Low T3, high reverse T3, and then the autoimmune reactivity against the thyroid. And then if you added a fourth, it would be low iodine. Now, it's very important to know, and I'm sure some of the listeners will know this too, is that you have to be very judicious when it comes to iodine supplementation when you have high antibodies, because it can trigger thyroid storm and autoimmune storm. So yes, you need iodine, but you have to be careful because it can trigger more autoimmune reactivity for people with Hashimoto's or predispositions for autoimmunity. So, but she did have it nonetheless, and we have to work on that. So the next things we saw here too was some liver enzymes being off. Her liver was a bit stressed. She had magnesium deficiency, which is responsible for a lot of different genetic pathways governing an immune system and mood. And she had low vitamin D, which is responsible for over 2,000 different genetic pathways. Really important to get that optimized for people with autoimmunity. And leptin being high as well. Leptin is a hormone that our fat cells produce, and they're supposed to tell the hypothalamic cells of the brain to burn fat. But the receptor sites to leptin in the hypothalamus is blunted, so it's contributing to her weight loss resistance. It's a hormonal resistance pattern. And you can see leptin being spiked with some of the things we found on these additional tests that I ran based off of her health history. Am I boring you guys? This is not much?
No,
okay.
This is great.
This is so good.
Right, perfect. So then these labs I added at the bottom, not everybody needs all the labs, right? I want to be comprehensive but still be cost effective with these labs. But based off of her health history, she needed these labs, and I'm so happy we ran them. So we looked at an absolute CD8, CD57 count. I'll explain that in a second. We look at Epstein-Barr virus, and we looked at C4A. We ran some other markers that aren't on here, that you don't see on here, but from different labs to confirm this stuff, but I'll explain what we found here. So CD57 by itself is an immune marker. It's associated in the Lyme literate world with something tick-borne. It may be Lyme disease. It may be something associated with Lyme. These things are called great mimickers or great imitators for a reason. A lot of things can look like Lyme and Lyme can look like a lot of things. So it's important to not be cavalier or flippant with throwing words around like you have Lyme disease. So I always like to follow up with additional testing to confirm this or not. For her, it was true. She had Lyme, Borrelia burgdorferi, and she had Babesia and Bartonella co-infections too. We ran IGeneX, and we can run ARM and IGeneX, one of these labs that are more thorough and expansive. We don't start with those labs. You don't just run labs for the sake of it. We want to do a first round, get a good perspective, and then we can confirm it if we need to after that. So this was contributing. What's the significance of this? It's a chronic infection that is associated in the scientific literature to triggering autoimmune issues. So she had these autoimmune reactivities in her body, like the thyroid antibodies and like how she was feeling with the runaway inflammation, like the C-reactive protein, for example. The next chronic infection we found was Epstein-Barr virus. This is what causes mono. It's associated with triggering autoimmune thyroid problems. It's associated with triggering other autoimmune issues too, chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, statistically, 95% of adults have had exposure to Epstein-Barr virus. So it's important to know, just because you see antibodies to Epstein-Barr virus doesn't necessarily mean that you have an active infection. So it's important to decipher the labs appropriately and interpret the labs appropriately. For her, this was an active infection according to the conventional lab, by the way. This is not just some super picky functional medicine lab. This was like a conventional lab saying it's a reactivated Epstein-Barr virus, which is associated with some of the things she was dealing with, like the fatigue and the autoimmune thyroid issues. And the third chronic infection, which very helpful that we have this data, is the C4A test. This is an immune marker that could indicate a mold toxicity or biotoxin like mold. And it's important to know here that the CD57, the Epstein-Barr virus, and the C4A were all lab high. This wasn't me just saying, oh, this is functionally elevated and it was outside of our range in functional medicine. This was actually the lab, in this case, Quest or LabCorp in the United States, showing that this was out of range. So if the lab is saying this is out of range, it's pretty out of the range. And we confirmed this with a mycotoxin test. We confirmed the Lyme with the other Lyme literate test, and Epstein-Barr virus, we didn't need any more testing. So what did we do here? Because now you look at all this data and you're like, what the heck do I do with all this stuff? This is when we organize treatment and we look at what I would consider upstream for her. A root cause in her case would be the chronic infections and the underlying gut problems, because I don't have the labs here, but there were a lot of things going on in her gut as well. There was intestinal permeability, there was dysbiosis, she had SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and then we confirmed those other chronic infections that I mentioned. So it's dealing with the chronic infection and the gut issues first, and then the inflammation tends to fall down when you do that. And then the hormonal issues can start to be balanced. Now, we still have to target the hormonal problems down the line, but you have to start, in my opinion, and a lot of functional medicine doctors would agree with me, you have to start with the upstream stuff first, which takes time. This is not a quick fix. This is months down the line. But you can see here, the numbers on the left, she was a lot better. Yellow means she was trending in the right direction, and green means she's entirely in optimal range. Pretty much everything got in the optimal range except the iodine, because I was being very careful with her autoimmune reactivity. Then once we calm her antibodies down, we can bring in some more iodine up. But other than that, pretty much, yeah, everything got optimized, which I was really excited about. She was 10 times more excited than I was. But when you start feeling like yourself again, it's exciting. And she's still in care now. This is an ongoing journey. But as someone feels better, we have a groove as to what's working for her and what's not. It's really rewarding. And I could talk about this all day, but I guess I'll stop now.
Wow. No, that's such a good example. Thanks for sharing that with us, Dr. Will, because obviously this is a woman that had fallen through the cracks, I suppose, of conventional medicine. But clearly, when you looked under the hood, there was a lot going on that could be remedied. So could you tell me again, her symptoms were she was fatigued, she had she was gaining weight or couldn't lose weight, and what other symptoms was she feeling?
Anxiety, like runaway anxiety. She had bloating because of the SIBO largely. She had joint pain that traveled around, which is quite classic for Lyme and tick-borne problems. She'd get rashes a lot. She's very sensitive to just about every food under the sun, even healthy foods. She was limited down to like a few foods. Those are the most common things. Hair loss, I think I mentioned that too. So those are the most common things that she's experiencing. And that is what I just mentioned for her. That is sadly things that I see to various degrees of different configurations of symptoms, but more or less the same set of things on an almost hourly basis. So I think one of the first things I say to someone like that is, you're not alone. There's an epidemic of people going through this right now that are well-read people. I mean, she knew all the stuff. She listened to all the summits, all the webinars. She was very well-read, but and I would say she was better off than she would be if she wasn't doing all those things. Like, she got herself a lot better on her own, but she was still stuck at this plateau and these things were still going on.
Okay, great. So let's talk about, what did you do with this woman? And as you said, this woman is fairly typical of what you see in your clinic all the time. So what is a general protocol you take people through, in particular with the elimination diet? You said that she was down to only a few foods, but obviously that's not ideal to only be on a few foods forever, right? So what is the process there? How do you bring people back and then expand again in a restorative way?
Sure. So for her, we put together a few protocols and had to put them all in synergy, because you can't give someone everything all at once. It's just too much for their body. So we organized this in the place where we went upstream and looked at the sort of the big picture. In my mind was, what's going on in the gut? What are the components to her case that are going to move the needle in the most significant way earlier on to get her head above water, so to speak, so she can start feeling better, and it motivates people to keep going because they feel like, oh, whoa, like they see things improving and they want to keep going. Because for somebody that's so burnt out like this, you don't have long for keeping them encouraged, because they've gone through so much already. So it's not about just looking at the lab. It's also making this as realistic and practical as you can and get them better as fast as you can. So for her, we strategized dealing with the mold toxicity protocol, which involves different herbs and different things like saunas to support her detoxification pathways, and the chronic infections as far as the tick-borne problems as well. So there was a mold and tick protocol that we'd cycle on and off over the coming months after we got those lab results back. And her food protocol, we took a very gut-centric, gentle approach to it. So it was a lot of soft cooked soups and stews. It was very much like, it wasn't directly a GAPS approach, but it was kind of, you could consider it a GAPS like approach, which stands for gut and psychology or gut and physiology syndrome. I know that you guys know that, but for people that don't know, it was sort of a hybrid GAPS but we tailored it a little bit differently for her to be low histamine, basically, because a lot of times people with SIBO and these reactions and the mold and the chronic infections, they're very sensitive to histamines, which bone broth can be higher in histamine. So we had to mitigate that a little bit with her, because the bone broth, while it's such a good gut healing tool for many people, for her was causing reactions. So that when you're reacting to bone broth, things are serious. And fermented foods were out of the question. All these sort of gut healing things that work great for some people, they work great for me, but causing flare-ups for her and many of my patients. So we just strategized sort of a low histamine version of a GAPS protocol. So that's what we did. And over time, I think by the time we retested, reintroduction already happened of certain foods. Look, this is a more advanced example that when I was writing the inflammation spectrum, I knew, okay, I had to get people like her moving in the right direction, but she wasn't necessarily going to get all the nuances that she needed from a book. So at the end of the inflammation spectrum, I wrote a letter basically to someone like her and said, look, these are all the other variables you take into consideration if that's you. This isn't needed for everybody. But for a complex case like her, something like the inflammation spectrum can get them really good, but may not get them 100% because we don't know the labs. We don't know what's specifically relevant for her. So she kind of started similar to the inflammation spectrum. And then from there, we had to lean into these more advanced approaches.
I think that's so important what you're saying there, just about testing. It was interesting, the caveman evolving. When I actually had my own testing, it showed that Sarah was very sensitive to dairy. That was probably one of the hugest things that changed you. But I was sensitive to gluten. The guy that was so into gluten was finally sensitive to it, which then explains a lot of.
Your body says, finally, he found out.
He needed to see it on paper to take it seriously.
I get that. Yeah.
So
that's a lot of people.
Yeah. So I think that's such a phenomenal case study for people to see that, and for people that are struggling right now, that are going through this journey. It's easy to see a case study and be like, oh, it's easy for them, but I think just to have hope. To see people like Dr. Will Cole. Do you still take patients?
Yeah.
Dr. Will? Yeah.
That's my day job. Hasn't stopped. I couldn't stop this. This is too much. It's so rewarding for me to see this. So yeah, I'm still seeing patients.
So cool.
That's so cool. And I think that's why you write such a great book, to be honest. Like we interview a lot of people for our series and our content we create, and the people that are in the trenches every day, like yourself, create such great content, which is why we have hundreds of positive reviews for your book. So if you're thinking, obviously, if you're not convinced you shouldn't buy it, you should buy it now. So there's a link in the description that you can just click below. But thank you, Dr. Will Cole. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience before we sign off today?
I would say maybe just have hope. I mean, people it's quite an isolating place to go through something like this, because on the outside, these people tend to look quote unquote normal. They could look healthy, and it's quite isolating for people not to understand how you feel. So to maybe just to reach out to somebody so you're not alone, and reach out to somebody that understands, reach out, even if it's not a functional medicine doctor, a community online of people that are going through similar things, because it really is aggravating people's health problems to be so isolated. And I think it's good for people to have a community of people that understand.
Beautiful. Well, thank you. Bless you, mate. You've been amazing.
Bless you, mate.
Bless you, mate.
Very Australian. We apologise.
I don't think any Australian says that, to be honest. I think that was my first time. But seriously,
I hear it all the time from my Aussie friends. I
bless you, mate.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you so much. We so appreciate you sharing your wisdom today. And I think hopefully, people see the opportunity here to book in an appointment for you, people that haven't gone that extra mile yet. It's very cool to know that, they can have one-on-one appointments with, a superstar like you. So that's awesome. So thank you again. We so appreciate your time. And we definitely are so keen to keep up with your new discoveries as you keep going on with all your patients.
Thank you so much. And the next time we're in the same city again, like New York or somewhere, we have to all hang out again.
What an incredible interview with Dr. Will Cole. I got so much out of that, particularly that lab section. So let us know what you thought of the interview in the comments below. Give us a like and subscribe if you're feeling up for it. And plus hit that notification bell because you don't want to miss the next video. All right, we'll see you guys next week.
Ciao, ciao.